Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of carbon dioxide removal.
CDR.
CDR. Yeah, exactly.
You got it.
As you all know, this is obviously a hot topic when we're talking about climate these days.
Absolutely.
And what we're looking at today is a really thought-provoking article from CarbonPlan.
Yeah.
And it really kind of challenges how we think about CDR.
I think what's so interesting about this article is it doesn't just try to define CDR.
Right.
Which can get, pretty complex.
Yeah.
But it pushes us to kind of ask, are we even focusing on the right questions in the first place?
It's like we're all working on this big climate puzzle.
Yeah.
But instead of figuring out how the pieces fit together, we're all arguing about what shape they are.
Precisely. Yeah.
So to get us all on the same page, the IPCC,
Yeah.
it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change,
Right.
defines CDR as removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it durably.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Should be so.
Yeah.
But then you get into scenarios where you're capturing CO2, say from a corn ethanol plant.
Okay.
And storing that.
Yeah.
On the surface, it ticks the boxes.
Yeah.
You're capturing CO2 and storing it. But
yeah.
the elephant in the room is that the whole process to get that ethanol is still pretty emissions intensive.
So is it really CDR?
Yeah, and that's exactly what the article brings up.
Right.
And, it kind of uses that as an example to point out two big areas where it gets really murky when we try to define CDR.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Okay.
First, we've got what they call indirect removal.
Right.
What is that?
Well, a lot of CDR methods, they don't actually grab CO2 directly out of the air.
Okay.
They're more like shifting carbon from what we call fast cycles to slow cycles.
Okay.
Imagine, carbon's moving around like it's in a relay race.
Okay.
So when we burn fossil fuels, that's like a sprinter taking off.
Yeah.
Carbon is being released into the atmosphere super quickly.
Right.
But storing carbon in things like trees or soil, that's more like a long distance runner.
Really?
A slow and steady jog where the carbon is locked away for much longer.
Right.
So a lot of CDR methods are essentially trying to move that carbon from the sprinting lane to the slow lane.
Okay.
So you're shifting it from that fast to that slow cycle.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
I'm already starting to see why just defining CDR might not be enough.
Right. And they use an analogy of a forest to kind of drive this home.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a healthy forest that's growing, it's naturally absorbing and storing CO2.
Right.
So preventing decomposition of that biomass is kind of like adding to that total carbon stored.
Right.
But that's only if that forest is healthy and keeps growing.
So it's more about managing the carbon that's already there than actually removing it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you run into the second problem, which is what they call net emitting systems.
Okay, so what does that mean?
So a lot of CDR approaches,
Mm-hmm.
like, the corn ethanol example we talked about, they're part of larger systems that are actually currently net emitters of carbon.
Okay.
So do we look at that CDR part in isolation?
Right.
Or do we have to look at,
the whole system.
those systems
Yeah.
with all its emissions?
Okay, and that seems like a really important distinction, and I have a feeling that's where this CarbonPlan article is going to start challenging some common assumptions.
You're exactly right. They argue that all this back and forth about how we define CDR is actually distracting us from the really important questions we should be asking.
So are they saying that the IPCC definition is wrong?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They acknowledge its importance, but they suggest that it's only a starting point.
Okay.
What they really want to do is move beyond these definitions and think more critically about the long-term effectiveness of different CDR approaches.
So what are they proposing instead?
Well, they point out that the common approach of just dividing everything into two buckets, CDR and avoided emissions, it's pretty limited.
Right.
Instead, they emphasize the IPCC's view that CDR actually has two crucial roles to play.
Okay.
In a future where we're at net zero emissions.
I'm all ears.
Okay.
Tell me more.
So the first one is tackling those emissions that are really hard to eliminate entirely.
Oh, yeah.
Think about certain industrial processes or even some aspects of agriculture.
Right.
There's always going to be some emissions hanging around.
Yeah.
And CDR can help us balance those out.
So CDR is like the cleanup crew for those hard to tackle emissions.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay.
And then that second crucial role is dealing with what we call legacy emissions.
Legacy emissions.
Legacy emissions.
Is that like emissions from our ancestors or something?
Kind of.
Okay.
It's all that CO2 that we've already pumped into the atmosphere.
Oh, okay.
Over decades and decades.
Right.
That's been contributing to climate change.
Right.
It's already up there.
It's already up there.
And CDR needs to actively remove that past carbon.
Okay.
If we want to get back on track.
Oh, so it's not just about dealing with the new emissions, it's about cleaning up the mess we've already made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their argument is we need to shift our focus from those definitions to these long-term goals.
Right.
When we're making decisions about investing in CDR right now.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do we do that? How do we shift our focus?
Well, they propose 4 key questions that we should be asking about any CDR approach.
Okay.
To kind of help us evaluate whether or not it's truly viable for the long haul.
Okay, this is where I think it gets really interesting for our listeners.
Yeah.
What are these 4 questions?
So the first question is probably the most thought-provoking.
Okay.
Is this activity part of a system that will actually exist at scale in a net zero world?
Oh.
So they're essentially telling us to apply a future test to every CDR approach.
Wait, a future test?
A future test.
I like that. Tell me more.
So it's not enough to just ask, does this CDR method work today?
Right.
We need to imagine a world where we've actually achieved net zero emissions. And will that CDR method still make sense in that context?
Oh.
So, let's go back to the corn ethanol.
Yeah.
If we're living in a world that's powered by renewable energy and sustainable practices, will corn-based ethanol even be around?
Right.
Or will it be replaced by something else entirely?
That's such an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
It's not just about whether it works in isolation, but how it fits into this bigger picture of a decarbonized future.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that leads into the second question.
You're one step ahead of me.
Yeah.
So the second question builds on that idea of system-level thinking.
Okay.
So they ask, can the system as a whole become net negative?
Mm-hmm.
So we're not just looking at that CDR part in isolation anymore.
Right.
We're thinking about that entire system it's embedded in.
Can you give me like a concrete example of what that means?
Sure. So they use a great example.
Yeah.
Enhanced rock weathering in agriculture.
Okay.
So the idea is by spreading crushed rock on fields, you can speed up natural weathering processes. That pulls CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay, that sounds promising.
Sounds promising, right?
Yeah.
But as the article points out, you have to consider that entire agricultural system.
Yeah.
Farming itself generates a lot of emissions.
Right.
From, making fertilizers to tilling the soil.
Right.
So even if that rock weathering is doing its job.
Yeah.
Can it ever actually outpace those agricultural emissions?
Right.
And make the whole system net negative?
Wow. So it's almost like you need this positive feedback loop where the benefits of the CDR are outweighing the emissions of the whole system it's a part of.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that highlights why it's so crucial to analyze these systems carefully.
Right.
And understand, all those complex interactions.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just focus on that CDR piece in isolation.
Yeah.
You have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Okay. I'm already seeing how these questions are really pushing us to think about CDR in a totally different way.
Yeah.
So it's a third question.
Okay, so the third question is where things get even more complex. It asks, can the full effects of an activity be accurately quantified, and are elements of the system beyond the activity's boundary effectively governed?
Oh, wow. That's a mouthful. Break that down for me.
Basically, it's about making sure we're not just looking at the intended consequences of a CDR approach.
Yeah.
We also need to consider any unintended ripple effects and make sure those are being managed effectively.
So it's not just about the science of CDR, but also the policies and regulations surrounding it.
Yeah, you got it. They talk about this risk of something called leakage.
Leakage. What does that mean in this context?
Think of it like trying to patch a leaky bucket. You might think you're storing carbon safely underground, but what if there are cracks or faulty wells?
Right.
That carbon could leak back into the atmosphere.
Right.
Or imagine you're using forests for CDR, and you successfully prevent deforestation in one area.
Okay.
Great. Right. But what if that just pushes deforestation to happen somewhere else? It's like squeezing a balloon. You might push the carbon out in one spot, but it could just pop up somewhere else.
So we need to think about the whole system and not just like the isolated area where the CDR is happening.
Exactly. And that's why, robust monitoring, verification, and governance are absolutely critical for any CDR project.
Right.
We need to make sure those unintended consequences are minimized.
Right.
And that we have systems in place to address them if they do occur.
It's like checks and balances to make sure the CDR is actually delivering what it promises.
Exactly. Now, the fourth and final question focuses on the future of CDR. It asks, Does the activity drive innovation and learning?
I like that. So it's not just about what works now, but about what could shape CDR in the future.
Right. It acknowledges that, CDR is still a relatively young field,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to invest in R&D to bring down those costs, improve efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
and, explore new and potentially game-changing approaches.
So it's about planting seeds for the future of CDR, not just harvesting what's available today.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Right.
Even if a specific CDR approach isn't, cost-effective or scalable today.
Right.
Investing in it could lead to valuable breakthroughs down the line.
Right.
Breakthroughs that could pave the way for, more viable solutions in the future.
You know what I find really interesting about these 4 questions?
Yeah.
Is that they shift our mindset from just focusing on definitions to taking a much broader and more strategic approach to CDR.
Yeah.
It's not just what is CDR anymore.
Right.
It's what kind of CDR do we need to actually create a sustainable future?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
No.
It's about making those smart investments today
Right.
that are going to set us up for success in that net zero world.
Right.
A world where CDR is going to play a critical role in balancing those residual emissions
Right.
and drawing down all that legacy carbon we've been talking about.
Okay, I'm sold. CarbonPlan has me convinced we need to be asking these 4 questions. But I have to admit, wrapping my head around all this makes me feel like I'm back in high school science class trying to remember all those carbon cycles.
I hear Jan. It's definitely complex stuff,
Yeah.
but that's why these conversations are so important.
Absolutely. So to recap, we've talked about how the CarbonPlan article challenges us to move beyond simple definitions of CDR and focus on these 4 key questions that they believe are essential for evaluating, the long-term viability of different approaches.
And remember, those questions are, is this activity part of a system that will actually exist at scale in a net zero world? Can the system as a whole become net negative? Can the full effects of an activity be accurately quantified? And are elements of the system beyond the activity's boundary effectively governed? And does this activity drive innovation and learning?
I'm curious, out of those 4 questions, which one stands out to you the most?
For me, it's that first question, that future test.
Yeah.
I think it's such a powerful concept because it really forces us to think beyond the here and now and consider the long-term implications of our choices.
Yeah, I agree. That one really resonated with me too. And I think it connects really well with their emphasis on system-level thinking.
Absolutely.
It's not enough to just focus on one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You need to understand how all those pieces fit together and how CDR interacts with, all these other systems.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, these questions aren't meant to be easy to answer.
Right.
They're meant to spark critical thinking and dialogue.
Right.
To challenge our assumptions and push us to consider different perspectives.
It's like they're giving us this framework for having more productive and informed conversations about CDR.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need right now. More conversations that move beyond the hype and the rhetoric.
Right.
And really grapple with the complexities of this challenge.
Couldn't agree more. But before we get too carried away with the big picture, I want to bring it back to some real-world examples.
Good idea. It's easy to get lost in the abstract.
Right.
So let's ground this conversation in some concrete cases.
Perfect. So remember that first question, the future test?
Yes.
Well, the article actually walks us through a few different CDR approaches and kind of applies this test to them.
Okay.
And one example that really stood out to me was their discussion of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS.
Ah, BECCS. That's definitely a hot topic in the CDR world. Can you remind our listeners what BECCS is all about?
Sure. It's basically the idea of growing plants like trees or crops that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow. Then you burn those plants to generate energy, but you capture the CO2 that's released during a combustion and store it underground, preventing it from going back into the atmosphere.
So you're creating kind of like a closed loop where you're continuously removing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly. But when you apply the future test to BECCS, things get a little more complicated. The article raises some interesting questions about the land use implications of BECCS.
Right. If you're going to be growing all these plants for BECCS, you need a lot of land. And that raises questions about, competition with food production, biodiversity, and other land uses.
Exactly. And it also ties back to that second question about systems becoming net negative. Because even if you're capturing and storing the CO2 from that combustion process, you have to think about all the other emissions involved in the BECCS life cycle.
Things like the emissions from producing fertilizers, transporting the biomass, and building the infrastructure for carbon capture and storage.
Right. So it's not just about the carbon you're capturing at the power plant. It's about the whole system.
Yeah.
And the article also points out that we need to consider the potential for leakage, which we talked about earlier.
Exactly. If the CO2 that you're storing underground leaks back into the atmosphere, the whole BECCS system loses its effectiveness.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the question of whether or not BECCS is actually driving innovation and learning.
Right. Are we investing in BECCS in a way that's like pushing the boundaries of the technology and helping us learn more about how to do CDR effectively? Or are we just deploying the same old technologies without really challenging ourselves to do better?
Those are all really important questions. And I think the article does a great job of laying out the complexities of BCCS and how it stacks up against those 4 key questions.
Okay, so BCCS is one example. Are there any others that they highlight in the article?
There are. Another one that caught my eye was their discussion of direct air capture, or DC.
Oh, I've heard a lot about DC lately. What's the basic idea behind it?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. These technologies use chemical processes to capture CO2 directly from the ambient air.
Okay.
And then that captured CO2 could be stored underground or used for various industrial processes.
So unlike BECS, which relies on plants to do that initial carbon capture, DC goes straight to the source.
Exactly.
Pulling it right out of the air.
Right. And that's one of its big advantages. It's not dependent on land use in the same way that BECCS is.
But I'm guessing there are some challenges with DCI as well.
Definitely. Right now, one of the biggest challenges is the energy intensity of these. It takes a lot of energy to run those chemical processes and capture that CO2.
So if that energy is coming from fossil fuels, then you're not really achieving net carbon removal, are you?
That's a valid concern. That's why it's crucial to think about the source of energy for these DAC systems.
Right.
Ideally, you'd want to be powering them with, renewable energy sources like solar or wind power.
That makes sense. But even if you're using renewable energy, there are still other challenges, right? Like the cost of DEF.
Absolutely. Right now, GDIS is still relatively expensive compared to other CDR approaches. And that's something that needs to come down if we want to see it deployed at scale.
So how does DEF stack up against those 4 key questions from CarbonPlan?
Well, let's start with that first question, the future test. Will DES still be relevant in a net zero world?
Right.
I think the answer is probably yes.
Okay.
Even in a decarbonized world, there will still be a need to remove legacy emissions and address those, hard to abate residual emissions.
Yeah.
And TK has the potential to play a role in both of those areas.
Okay, so it passes the future test. What about the other questions?
Well, the second question about becoming net negative is a bit trickier.
Oh, okay.
As we talked about, the energy source for DI is crucial. If it's powered by fossil fuels, then it's not going to be net negative.
Right.
But if it's powered by renewables, then it has the potential to be.
So the jury's still out on that one. What about that third question, the one about quantifying the full effects and ensuring proper governance?
That's an important consideration for DI, just like it is for any CDR approach.
Right.
We need to make sure we're accurately measuring the amount of CO2 that's being captured and stored, and we need to have safeguards in place to prevent leakage.
And of course, there's the question of whether DACI is driving innovation and learning.
Right. And I think there's a lot of exciting research and development happening in the DI space. People are working on new materials and processes that could make DPAs more efficient and less energy intensive.
So it seems like DACI has the potential to be a valuable tool in our CDR toolkit, but it's still early days.
Yeah.
We need to continue to invest in R&D and carefully consider how DACI fits into this broader picture of a sustainable future.
I couldn't agree more.
It's amazing to think about all these different approaches to CDR that are being developed right now.
Yeah.
It feels like we're still in the early stages of figuring out what works best and how to scale these technologies up, to meet the challenge of climate change.
It's definitely an exciting time to be working in this field.
Yeah.
There's so much innovation happening, and we're learning new things all the time.
Right.
But I think it's also important to be realistic about the challenges ahead.
So what do you see as like the biggest hurdles to scaling up CDR?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is cost.
Yeah.
As we talked about earlier.
Right.
A lot of these CDR approaches are still relatively expensive.
Right.
And if we want to see them deployed at a scale that can really make a difference, we need to find ways to bring those costs down.
Yeah, because even if a CDR technology works perfectly in a lab setting, it's not going to be very useful if it's too expensive to actually implement in the real world.
Exactly. And then beyond cost, there are also technical challenges to overcome.
Right.
For example, we need to improve the efficiency of carbon capture technologies and find safe and reliable ways to store that captured CO2 over the long term.
Right. And then there's also the social and political challenges. How do we build public support for CDR? How do we ensure that, CDR is deployed in a way that's equitable and benefits everyone?
Yeah. Those are all crucial questions. And I think, the CarbonPlan article does a great job of highlighting how these social, political, and economic factors are just as important as the technical aspects of CDR.
It's a reminder that we need to think holistically about CDR and consider not just the technology itself, but also the systems and policies that surround it. It's like you could have the most amazing electric car in the world, but it's not going to get you very far if there aren't enough charging stations.
That's a perfect analogy. We need to build the infrastructure, the policies, the public support to enable CDR to flourish.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with from this deep dive?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they'll come away with a deeper understanding of the complexities of CDR.
Right.
And the importance of asking those 4 key questions that CarbonPlan has laid out. It's not enough to just talk about capturing carbon.
Right.
We need to be thinking critically about the long-term viability and effectiveness of different CDR approaches.
Right. We can't just assume that any technology that removes carbon is automatically a good thing.
Yeah.
We need to be smart about how we invest in and deploy CDR.
Absolutely. And I also hope listeners will be inspired by the incredible innovation that's happening in this space.
Yeah.
There's so many brilliant people working on this problem.
Yeah.
And I'm confident that, we can develop and scale up the solutions we need to address climate change.
I share your optimism. And I think the CarbonPlan article, despite all the tough questions it raises, it ultimately leaves us with the sense of hope. It's a call to action, a reminder that we have the power to shape the future of CDR.
Absolutely.
And create a more sustainable world.
And if I can leave you with one final thought, it's this. The article focuses on evaluating different CDR approaches, but what about evaluating the questions themselves? Are these the best questions to guide our investments and our decisions?
Oh, wow.
What other questions should we be asking as we navigate this, complex landscape?
That's such a great point. It's like going meta on the whole CDR discussion. It reminds us that we need to constantly be questioning our assumptions and refining our approach as we learn more about CDR.
Absolutely.
And its potential role in tackling climate change.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of discovery and adaptation.
Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking this complex topic.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground today.
So for those of you who are eager to learn more, I highly encourage you to check out the full article from CarbonPlan.
Yeah.
They're doing some fantastic work in this space, and they're definitely worth following. And as always, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.